Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and we're going to have a trifecta roundtable tonight, folks. We have three guests with us that have all worked on this incredible book called The Aztec UFO Incident. We've got Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, as well as Dr. Frank Thaler. And what we're going to discuss is just this incredible UFO crash that happened in New Mexico in the late 40s. And I just want to read a quick excerpt. Here we go. In the high desert of New Mexico, early morning, March 25th, 1948, a rancher leaves his house to let his goats out of the corral. There is a loud noise that draws his eyes to the sky, where he sees a silver flying saucer wobbling as if it is in distress. The saucer scrapes along a rock cliff, causing sparks, and then heads north, landing on a mesa. A group of witnesses gather to examine the craft, including ranchers, oil field workers, police, a county commissioner, and a preacher. They find that the craft is still intact, except for a small hole the size of a quarter. They decide to grab a pole from one of their trucks and began poking inside of the craft. Probably not the smartest thing to do, but nonetheless, suddenly the craft opens and reveals two slumped over, dead beings. As if this isn't amazing enough, there is so much more to this comprehensive study and documentation of a historical event. Meet the witnesses and scientists that worked on the craft, follow the individuals involved in the cover-up, and the enduring impact that the incident had on their lives, as well as ours. Now available through Career Press, The Aztec UFO Incident. You can buy it direct at theaztecincident.com. Guys, it's great to have you on the show here with the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Super. Doing great.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Awesome. Well, this is a real honor to speak with you guys. I know that many of our listeners here at the Leak Project and youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord just love the opportunities and possibilities of what's out there in the solar system. And there's so much information, disinformation, everything in between on the subject. I really want to dive into this. But before we do, just give our audience a quick description of all of you guys. Then we're going to jump into the work here that you put together so eloquently.
I own a small business here in Morrisville. It's an all-natural root beer that I produce. I lived in the Four Corners for many years. I was very familiar with this case and met Scott, and we've been working on it together as well as with Dr. Thayer since.
That's great. And what do you do, Scott?
I'm a partner in a magnet wire company here in Charlotte. We make magnet wire that creates a magnetic field, winding wire that goes into an electric motor, generator, transformer. We do work for maglev, transportation, MRI, CT, any magnetic fields. We make a wire that creates that. And I've been doing that now for 33 years. I'm the vice president of sales and marketing.
Oh, fantastic. And then, Frank, what about you?
Well, when people ask me what I do, I say I write stuff. That seems to be my life. I'm a professor emeritus at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, and I've spent a very long career in journalism education. But as you can see, this is an avocation and a story. This story, I just never get tired of it.
I mean, it's so exciting to think of the possibilities. And one of the things that I'm definitely wondering is the discoveries that you guys have come up with and the people that you've talked to, etc. These craft, do they have a similarity to the ones that were found outside of Roswell as well?
I don't think so. Excuse me. The Aztec crash saucer or landed saucer, by everybody's description, was large, enormous by some standards. It was 100 feet across, 18 to 20 feet tall. The ones reported down in Roswell were much smaller, 30, 40 foot maybe. It was hard to tell at the one debris field, according to the Roswell researchers, because it had impacted and broke up. The being's description isn't close. We looked at this in great detail over the years to think, was this a story that was being confused with Roswell? But other than they both happened in New Mexico, that's pretty much where the similarities end.
So the beans also, I've talked to several, like, Stanton Friedman and other people, Tom Fletcher, I think, that have done all sorts of research into the Roswell case. And they said that there was one being that came out alive and talked to one of the people telepathically and said he knew what his fate was going to be. Everything was fine. And he described them as, being your typical gray type. What do these beings look like?
They were more childlike in appearance, 3.5 to 4 feet tall. But everybody we interviewed described them as childlike.
And at the time when the bodies were seen, they had been burned on the outside, but they had all similar style jumpsuits on, in a bluish color, and perfect teeth. That's always something that comes up. So maybe that's something we can strive for, huh?
Right. Now, you said they described him as being childlike and had blue outfits on. Does that mean, do they describe him as like a 13-year-old kid or something? And, just a regular person, but young?
I would say younger than a 13-year-old, almost like children, childlike. I'm interpreting this from interviewing people, but young kids, maybe, elementary school size, 3.5 to 4 feet.
And who exactly, did you guys talk to people that physically saw these beings?
Yes.
That's the key, Rex, that Scott was able to find two people who were there at the time and very old when he interviewed them, and they told identical stories. To actually talk to the witnesses was one key that unlocked this whole story.
And some of the witnesses didn't know each other, so it wasn't like they could all get together. They were from different parts of the country.
Why do you guys think there was such a big, there's so many sightings in the late 40s after that one in Roswell or this one? There was just this enormous amount. Do you think that something in particular caused all of these ETs to visit Earth at that time?
Well, you got to look at New Mexico. What part of the country are you in, Rex?
Okay, so I am in San Antonio, Texas right now, but I have gone all around New Mexico. Just a big fan of the Four Corners area. I've been to Dulce, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, the Badlands, Roswell, Carlsbad. I know the area well. It's just gorgeous out there.
Oh, it is. It is. But let's look at what was going on in, 47, 48, even today. You had post-war, we're going into the Cold War. You had the Trinity site right there at White Sands. You had early radar being developed and experimented with. You have Los Alamos National Labs, just over 100 air miles from where the Aztec is. Sandia National Labs, a lot of top secret military bases, 3 top secret radar facilities. There was a lot going on, and part of me wants to say, did they watch the Trinity site detonation? And did that draw attention to New Mexico? I don't know. It's speculation, but there was a lot going on.
Think of how far out you could see that happen.
Right. And remember, too, that we were just firing rockets out of White Sands. So these were going up into the lower atmosphere at that time, too. Yep. Atomic bomb wing at Roswell Army Airfield, or lately Walker Air Force Base. So there was more military in New Mexico than there were civilians at that time.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we point out in the book, to Frank's point, there was something like, I'm going to round the numbers off, 250 police officers in the state of New Mexico. That's sheriff, local constables, and highway patrol. There were over 2,500 military police, a 10-to-1 ratio.
Now, also, there's a lot of speculation that there could be underground bases in New Mexico, especially around the Dulce area. And do you guys feel that that is a possibility? And if so, do you think that there could be bases that are older than ours down there?
Well, I'm probably the only person you'll ever interview that's ever camped on top of Mount Archuleta in Dulce. I've been to the top twice with a team of people. We mapped it out. Back when we were looking for the radar bases, we picked all the high points in New Mexico and did expeditions to them. Getting to the top is very, very difficult because you have to cross through 2 tribal areas, and it takes about 8 hours to get to the top. And we camped up there for a total of 5 days. I can pretty much assure you that that is nothing more than a very, very good campfire story. We found the tunnels, we found the secret railroad lines, and then we found that there was a very legitimate mining operation in Dulce. But nobody likes to talk about it because it sounds better if we talk about underground alien bases.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Frank, if I can just interject for a moment, because there was this weird synchronicity how I ended up there over last Labor Day weekend. I had a funeral to go to in Utah. So we went out, and on the way back, we couldn't find any hotels. And so the only hotel we could find on our phone was the one in Dulce at the casino
Best
out
Western.
there. And
Yep.
so we went out there, and the people were so friendly. And we actually ended up meeting some really cool people out there that gave us access up the mesa. We went up about 3/4 of the way and ended up turning back around because the roads were pretty intense, like you said, and I was a little bit nervous about getting a flat tire. I didn't have a good spare, even though we have 4-wheel drive. So, but the interesting thing was I talked to several people out there from different areas. And one of them worked in the casino, at the hotel, one of them worked at the grocery store, and a couple other people, I don't want to say what positions they have because they wanted to stay off the books or off the records. Real friendly though. But they had all said that they had seen real cool lights and anomalies. One person in particular said he spent the weekend up at the mesa with his sister when he was a little kid, and they saw these lights come down, and they were right there hovering them over about 30 minutes, and they changed colors and stuff, and then they took off. So it's interesting.
If I can just offer something, having lived in the area, I think that you're pulling multiple things together. As Scott was describing, Archuleta Mesa and actually where the supposed sites are for the underground bases is one thing. Lights and anomalies are another whole thing.
Oh,
that
absolutely.
entire area is inundated. We have actually people that have served as senators and representatives up in the Four Corners area that used to lay on the ground and watch the things happen above them in the part of Colorado, southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. So, there are many documentations of that, but I clearly think they are two very different things that you're talking about.
I certainly, and I wasn't trying to connect the dots like that.
Sure,
Across that way.
that's fine.
That's fine. I just was trying to clarify that.
Sure, because I've also noticed that there is so much disinformation out there, and I was talking to some people in Dulce about that. You type in Dulce, New Mexico, and one of the first things that comes up are satellite imageries of the schools out there, and people are saying that those are, a part of the underground base networks and stuff like that. So there is a lot of disinformation out there. And Frank, I got to tell you, I'm so glad that you're bringing this information out for our audience to hear this, because that's what the Leak Project is out here for, is to get to the truth. And I think that that's awesome. So, let's jump into this Aztec story if we could more. And where exactly was the crash at? That's incredible.
Well,
Frank.
okay. Well, you go into Aztec and there's a road coming out of town, and it heads east, and about 11.5 miles, dirt road, ranch road, oil company road, 11.5 miles, and it makes a loop called the Arkansas Loop, and then it heads north into Colorado. Well, you have this mesa, perfect mesa. You stop, there's a parking area. You can walk up on the mesa, and you look, and you walk around, and there is a perfect space there that would accept a 100-foot saucer. There's no doubt about it that it would accommodate that particular thing. And this is one of the few places that we know of that the exact location of the landing or a crash or whatever you want to call it is pinpointed. And a lot of people have figured this out, and a lot of people have tried to deny it. And so it was 1950 when the book came out telling us that Aztec was real, and 3 years later it was buried, and it would have stayed buried if it hadn't been from some intrepid researchers, including William Steinman and Scott Ramsey, of course, who spent 30 years and a fortune doing his own research. He spent more time at the crash site than anybody I've ever heard of. Right, Scott?
No, I've spent a lot of, speaking of camping, that used to be a favorite camping site when I was doing the research.
Oh, nice. Nice. Is this map pretty accurate that I've got pulled up on the screen right here?
I would,
Yes.
I can't see it, but is it out of the book?
Yes. No, it's,
Yeah, that map was done by
That's
Bill
right.
Metzger,
Direction-
I believe. And he's
Perfect.
a map maker by profession.
Okay. Just wanted to give people a reference point if they wanted to possibly go out there and do the same camp out, take some infrared stuff, and maybe pick something. Do you think that is there still a lot of activity out there?
Meaning sightings?
Yeah, just different anomalies and such?
Yeah, Suzanne and I get emails every now and again from oil field workers or hunters, and they have to tell a story about what happened. That area's been particularly strange for probably a number of years. I don't know what that is with the connection to Aztec. I have my own theories on that. So does Frank, and so does Suzanne. But if anybody does want to go out there, and I highly recommend they do, if you're traveling into the Four Corners area, the only thing I will recommend is go to the Hertz rental at the Farmington Airport and ask them for a high ground clearance four-wheel drive vehicle. And if you tell any of the employees behind the counter that you're going to the crash site, they'll know exactly what type of vehicle to give you.
Oh, that's great. They've done that a few times.
All over the last 30 years, yeah. The road now and then gets so bad that a conventional four-wheel drive vehicle can get hung up on the ground.
I might add, if you do have an opportunity to go, it is breathtakingly beautiful. If you have no interest and just want to go and see a beautiful area, you can see the La Plata Mountains that are covered or have some snow on almost year-round from that distance. It is just a breathtaking view. It really, truly is.
But we've had friends and acquaintances over the years that tried to go out in a conventional passenger car, and they all come back with a really bad story. The other problem at being out there is take blankets and a cooler. I've been out there, and with a moment's notice, a storm will come in and make the roads wet and impassable, and they may not have had a drop of rain 11 and a half miles away in downtown Aztec.
Likewise, you want to always be sure and take water with you as you go out there.
Water and blankets.
You're at a high elevation. It's over a mile high elevation. And so it's just a good idea to be prepared.
Absolutely. The high desert is very non-forgiving, and if you don't have water, things can get ugly real quick.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, I would also like to know more about the UFO sightings and the crash itself. I mean, because you talk about different witnesses and stuff like that. So if you could walk us through some of the descriptions and maybe some of the connections and reference points.
I'll start and I'll let Thayer finish. He always does such a better job than me. Well, the story, of course, it really starts down in Cuba, New Mexico, with Manuel Sandoval, who worked on the Southern Union Pipeline during the day, and he was a part-time deputy for the town of Cuba, New Mexico, which is roughly 95 miles away. He and Highway Patrolman Andy Andrews had been having sightings for weeks before March 25th, 1948. And as Sandoval and Andy Andrews would meet for coffee, they would discuss the sightings and what they had seen. And on the early wee hours of March 25th, or even maybe prior to midnight on the 24th, Manuel had a sighting of a craft. And again, to his description to his friends, it looked in trouble, which kind of fits hand in hand with Valentin Archuleta, who was first found by Bill Steinman years ago. Sandoval decided to follow it that night because it did look like it was distressed. And we have a map in the book, from Cuba up to Archuleta Ranch, where Valentin, said he saw it early morning before 5 o'clock, bounce off his mesa and then head due north, which if you draw a straight line, as we illustrate in the book, is Hard Canyon. And the craft comes to rest on a mesa. We sometimes use the word crash, and maybe I overuse that word, almost like an emergency landing.
If I can just interrupt just for a second, a mesa, in case you're not familiar with that term, is like a tabletop mountain, is what it is.
Yeah, a mountain with a very flat top. About this time, Doug Nolan and Bill Ferguson, who worked for the El Paso Gas Company, is that right, Frank?
Oil company.
Oil company, I'm sorry. Oil company. We just got criticized because I goofed that up in the book. They are going down to visit an oil well, and instead they're redirected out to Hard Canyon Road because of a reported brush fire near the company drip tanks, which, as we show in the book, sit directly underneath the crash site. Well, having a fire near your drip tanks could lead into a disaster, so they decide to get out there to evaluate the fire. And as they get out there, other oil field workers are greeting them, saying, "Don't worry about the fire. It's a brush fire way up on the mesa. The tanks are secure, but you really need to come up because there's something laying up here. We have no clue what it is." And as they all gather up there, it's this 100-foot across flying disc, or as Doug Nolan called it, a lenticular disc. No noticeable doors, windows, rivets, nuts, bolts. To describe what Doug said, his exact words were, it looked like it had been molded. It had been popped out of a mold. And then other oil field workers gather. Mr. and Mrs. Knight, which were well-known ranchers of that area, came up across it. The bodies were seen through some very mirrored type of portholes, kind of like our mirrored sunglasses that were real popular back in the 70s and 80s. And that's kind of where the story starts, and then it goes off in many directions after that.
Okay. Well, Rex, think about this. You have 16 people on the mesa and a couple of cops. And these are remembered by these two witnesses, Doug Nolan, who was the main witness, and one other fellow who didn't know Doug Nolan, and he was there, and he gave the same story.
That was Ken Farley
That's right.
On his way to California.
And we had a preacher up there. I love the preacher story, Solon Brown. He was a Baptist preacher from Colorado who did missionary work in the Four Corners area. He was all around, and he saw a bunch of dust trails on the road, followed it. He thought there might be an accident. He walked up on the mesa, and he saw the saucer. The saucer opened up, and he saw the bodies lying on the ground. And we figure 16 of these little bodies were stretched out. And of course, after the military arrived, they started to debrief people. But this is such a movie moment to me. It was 16 people, smoldering brush in the background, a 100-foot disc lying there, and a bunch of bodies that didn't belong on Earth. And if that isn't the key story that started the whole UFO thing, I don't know what is.
And let me jump in here also, because wasn't there a huge campaign for creating disinformation? Like they tried to smear this as it was just an elaborate hoax.
Oh boy, didn't they always? Right, Suzanne?
Yes.
So what took place with that? How did they do it? And I mean, were they coming out with news articles saying that these people made things up? Because I got to tell you, when you look at the people's just reference, their types of positions, you got a preacher, law enforcement, and a commissioner. I mean, these are all it almost sounds too good to be true, like it is a movie.
Mm-hmm.
Well, where do you want to start with this? I think, number one, in 1948, you trusted the government. If the government told you to keep your mouth shut for national security, you did it. You can't imagine what it's like to trust the government today, but you could back then. This story never got out in 1948. That's number one. Number two, it got out in 1950 because some scientists who worked on the saucer after it was removed talked to an oil man who then talked to a columnist in Hollywood, and it ended up being a best-selling book. And after that, a vendetta occurred that ended up in court and branded the Aztec incident as a hoax from there until the late 1980s. Go on, Scott.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean that's kind of it. Once J.P. Kahn, who had once been a full-time writer at the San Francisco Chronicle, once he thought he had bought the story from Frank Scully, who came out with Behind the Flying Saucers in September 1950, the one Frank referenced. He thought he had ownership of that story and thought he had cut a deal to buy it, trying to convince Frank Scully that we can make a bigger story out of this than you can. You know, we're the Chronicle. And apparently there was some gross misunderstandings between the deal, because Scully said, why would I sell you the story? I already have Henry Hoyt and Company, my publishing company, lined up to do the book. And quite frankly, the story is not for sale. And that's where J.P. Kahn really went, I mean, to the point, as we show in the book, he somehow had direct access to J. Edgar Hoover, wrote him a letter telling him about this con that was going on. And, you know, we have several copies of the letters back and forth where he was saying that, you know, this story is being leaked. It's being done by a bunch of con men. And that just shot it right through the legal roof, so to speak. And like Frank said, by 1953, this was a non-event.
J.P. Kahn was very well-to-do. He was wealthy, had inherited a great amount of money, and never had to work a day in his life, and had the ways and means and time, which most of us wouldn't, to go about discrediting each and every one of the witnesses and the people involved. And I think from my standpoint, it was someone whose ego had been pretty heavily bruised, that he felt he had it in the bag, and it fell through.
And go ahead, Rex. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to ask, do you feel that the government was also very influential behind the scenes, maybe, to these people that had access to this stuff? Because you look at the Roswell incident, and it was Tom Carey, actually. I didn't mean to get his name wrong at the beginning. But he, you know, said that the sheriff in Roswell at the time was threatened by the military, that he needs to go around to all the witnesses and say, if you talk, you're done. You're done. And then he was threatened after he did all that by, you know, people in the military that said, well, you're not doing a good enough job freaking people out and, you know, making sure that they keep quiet. So there's got to be some influence behind the scenes possibly too, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think where Kahn was going was his ego and his nose got bent out of shape, and he was going to J. Edgar Hoover. But I think once Hoover and the military talked, they weren't really as interested in the con men. They're more interested in who in the heck is leaking the story, and we'll use the con story as part of, meaning con artist. We'll use that angle to discredit the story and get it the hell off the front page.
And it surely did work. Remember that the way it started was a lecture in 1950 in the University of Denver, when a scientist X, which was Silas Newton, the oil man, got up and talked to a Science 101 class about the fact there is a flying saucer. There is such a thing. And he was hustled off the stage, and the Air Force wasn't long getting into town researching. And we do have a CD with the interview of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations talking to a radio guy about this, trying to find out where the artifacts are and what he knows about the flying saucer at Aztec. And it's all in the book. And it shows that the government was really eager to get this story suppressed. And it worked until some people decided to start researching in the 80s.
Now, as far as all the documents, there's over 50,000, aren't there, as pertaining to this incident?
There's probably more than that, but that's what we have is over 50,000.
We say 55,000. That's probably closer to 60.
Okay. And they're each, I mean, talk to us about some of them. White papers and such, declassified. I mean, how do you get access to all this stuff?
Well, yeah, a lot is archival research at the United States Air Force Archive at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. Some are from the FBI archives in Winchester, Virginia, and McLean. Some from the CIA archives. Some from Army CID out of Fort Belvoir, Maryland. But a lot are something as simple as a confirmation letter that somebody did work for somebody back in 1948, just to make sure we've done our due diligence and haven't had the wool pulled over our eyes. There was a dispute in time over the date of the crash. And so we pulled some real estate records to see who really owned the land in 48, because a gentleman was saying he owned it and that there's no way a saucer crashed there. And we pulled the real estate records, and he hadn't purchased the land till 52 or 3. I forget what year, but it was May. And he was a very rock solid person in the town of Aztec. So the pillar of the community. So when he was saying, oops, you got a problem here, we had to take that very serious.
We really try to leave no stone unturned. If we can document it, then we feel we can put it in the book. If we can't, then it doesn't go in the book.
I mean, that's great. Also, though, I'm wondering how much information that you're getting is stuff that, I don't know, kind of maybe wag the dog scenario. Do you think that there's a lot of disinformation with the documents that you're getting also?
I highly doubt it, because most of the documents that we got out of the Air Force archives, I was there personally when we sent the Freedom of Information Act in. And I was there. I got in Sunday night, left the next Saturday morning. I was there at the archives for 5 solid days. And a lot of the documents, or the majority of the documents, all had to be read by intelligence people before they could release them to me. And on the card filing, if you go down to Maxwell Air Force Base and you request a document, let's say a relative that was lost in the Vietnam War, he was an F-4 Phantom pilot, and you go down there and you pull the record, chances are you're going to be 15th or 16th if somebody's read that report. Other people in the military, the General Accounting Office, maybe other family members that requested it, maybe other people that flew in his unit. However, for most of the Aztec documents, the majority, my name and date is the first one on the declassification manuscript.
And that pertains to other archives that we've gone to, too. The University of Minnesota Library, they've got vaults and underground storage areas that no one has even gone into those documents since they were closed, which would have been
September 1950.
1950. And so when they're brought out, you've got to wear your little white gloves and all of that. They bring it out, and clearly those have never been, no one has ever requested them. So, those type of documents, I cannot imagine how they could have been altered.
And Rex, keep in mind, when we get down to Maxwell Air Force Base, the Air Force are some of the most most wonderful people to deal with to do archival research. They will literally bust their backs to help you. But that doesn't mean they give you every document you request. The procedure down there is you put through your Freedom of Information Act request. They review it. They pull the documents. They read the documents. If they decide to release them to you, they will take it and redact it and either white out or make a copy, and then they redact it. Then they make another copy to make sure you can't read through the redaction, and then they will release it to you. If they deny it, you appeal it. They have 3 business days to get back to you, especially since you're standing there. But that doesn't mean we got every document. We probably got less than 10% of all the documents over the years we've requested. And it's not a conspiracy. It's because that's kind of the way it works. If there's anything in there that would be sources, methods, or means, and how they acquired the information, they don't have to give it to you.
That's good that you can get as much information that you are. And also, with the size of the craft being approximately 100 feet across, I'm trying to figure out how they would move it, hide it. I mean, just to put it on a road, you've got maybe a 12, 14-foot beam there, or it's going to be too much. So what do they do? They put it up vertically, and then they just transport it with some wormhole technology?
Well,
No.
Scott really went into this. There's a whole chapter, and they spent a lot of money and a lot of time researching it. Go for it, Scott.
Well, that was Suzanne and I were laying there one night, just kind of, Thayer and she and I had decided to go ahead and at least start looking at the possibility of doing a book. And I said, if I'm an outsider looking in, the first criticism I'm going to have of this whole case is how the hell do you move a 100-foot craft? And so to make a very long chapter very short, we enlisted the help of Bill Metzger, who I mentioned earlier. He was and still is, the world-renowned expert on moving high, wide shipments, which is the proper name for it, high and wide. And Bill had retired from that industry, and I knew him very well because my father was the other world-renowned expert on how to do that, and Bill worked for my dad. We contacted Bill and his wife, Pam, told him about the project we were working on and the up-and-coming book that we hope to do. And we went out to the Four Corners area for over a week. And what we did was reenacted moving the craft as described in Frank Scully's book as to how it came apart.
Came apart in 3 pieces. And so we based it on that in terms of the moving.
And we took pull rods and poke rods and measuring tapes. And there's a controversy that's been floating around as to what roads were done back in 1948. We decided to go with what the museum claimed was the correct roads. And that unfortunately made it much more difficult to move the craft, but we cleared it. At the end of the day, we did it twice. We went from the crash site out to the main road, which back then was Highway 44. And then we went from Highway 44 back to the crash site, just to do it twice to make sure we didn't miss anything.
If I can add something, when we started this out, or I can speak for Scott, and then as I came on board, and then Frank, we were skeptical and wanted to have every stone that we could possibly find picked up and turned around and looked in every direction. And what we found was any experts that we brought on board, that we hired, we made sure that they were not, I'm a believer in UFOs, or I want to, trying to prove it, because that was never our goal. This could have just as easily been completely discredited if that's the results that we found. So when we hired Bill Metzger, we asked him his opinion on UFOs, and he could given care less. And
very skeptical.
He was actually skeptical, and he said, I can't imagine that's what it was. And we said, good, that's just the type of person that we want. We didn't want him reading something into the results.
Okay, Bill's career with my dad was moving things like huge transformers, generators, turbines. Even before Bill came to work for my dad, they were doing rocket boosters for NASA, Saturn V sections for the Apollo program. So they were used to very large items and what bridges could they go under, what railroad lanes could they run on. But Bill looked at it as I don't care if we're moving a flying saucer or a boiler. All I know is I got the dimensions in my head and I know the road we have to take. And that we did a whole chapter in the book, including Bill wrote some of the chapter too, in his own words. But at the end of the day, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most difficult. And by the way, we had to do this with 1948 technology, not 2011 technology. And at the end of the day, Bill wrote that on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most difficult, that moving the Aztec flying saucer would have been a 3. And with the assets of the United States military, it may have been a 1 or a 2. So it was a lot of work in a hot August, 100 plus degrees, but it was something that had to be done.
Now, where do they take it?
I don't know. That would be pure speculation on my part. I would lean toward eventually it would end up at Wright Pat.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Of course, I think based on the scientists who worked on it, we came to the conclusion that intermediate location was Los Alamos, which is the nearest secure location. And that may have been where they did the first examination before finding a way to get it to Dayton, Ohio.
We've interviewed a gentleman, which I won't give you a lot of the details because it's a work in process. He claims in 1958, 10 years after the recovery, that it was seen by he and some other people at Wright-Patterson, and that it was plainly referred to as the craft recovered from Aztec, New Mexico.
Okay.
And he has proven so far to be extremely credible. We haven't found any chinks in his armor yet.
You've also talked to scientists or engineers that have worked on this craft, correct?
Not directly. We have researched the scientists who we feel we have properly identified at the early stages. This gentleman would be an exception, but we haven't completely proven to our satisfaction. We haven't seen anything yet that's bad, but if he proves out, then we can say we've talked to one.
Most of them they had all passed. All but one or two had passed by the time we had started working on the book.
But Rex, remember that Frank Scully knew these scientists, and we had a full chapter describing the possible scientists who were doing magnetic research, could have known Silas Newton, and could have talked to Frank Scully. But Frank Scully never identified any of those scientists. He called them Dr. G, a composite of 8 or 9 scientists. And despite all the pressure and all the threats, neither he nor Silas Newton, even after Silas Newton was charged with fraud, they would never admit the names of those scientists. So they were serious about it.
And I talked to his daughter years back, and she said that even on literally his deathbed, he would not divulge the names of the real scientists.
You know, another thing, too, that I'm thinking about is the name. I just love it. Frank Scully. I think of the X-Files. You've got Mulder and Scully. I wonder if there was some type of, subliminal connection there.
There was no subliminal. Chris Carter, the creator, purposely was very familiar with the incident in Aztec and named Dana Scully after Frank Scully.
Perfect.
And remember,
hey, Rex, question for you: the last TV series when they brought the X-Files back, did you watch it?
Oh yeah, I watched all the episodes.
Did you remember what happened in the first one?
There was a lot that happened. I don't know if I remember everything, but refresh my memory. Just give me
the opening scene, the flying saucer that hits the mesa and that goes tumbling in the desert.
Yes, yeah, the TR-3B, I think is what it was. No, that was the Roswell disc, yeah, and then they said they did that. They came out because of all the nuclear testing that was being taken in New Mexico, correct?
Well, that's kind of correct. Watch it again on Netflix, and the caption on the bottom says Northwest New Mexico.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what does Mulder say?
Yeah, go ahead.
And then twice during the next several episodes, Muller's in a conversation with different people, and his statement was about Aztec being more important than Roswell, and let's not forget Aztec. He referred to it on several occasions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's nice, very nice to see awareness and information being raised about Aztec, because it is a comprehensive case unlike any other case. Think about that. We have the pre-sightings, we have the crash or the landing, we have bodies, we have witnesses, we have the scientists who worked on it, and then what happened with some of the things afterwards. And so to my knowledge, there's not another documentation of that. I think that it's very exciting.
Right after that episode aired, Frank Thayer, Suzanne, and I sent a copy of our new book to Chris Carter.
Did he get back to you?
No, and I didn't expect to. He's a busy guy. But at least now he's apparently always had some kind of interest in Aztec. And for Mulder to bring that up and be talking to Scully and some scientists and say, remember, this isn't the most important case, Aztec is. That got our attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. As a matter of fact, I think that I'm going to have to watch the series again because I definitely look for those subliminal type messages and programming and stuff where they give these little hints and stuff. And if you're not really looking for it, it can kind of go right past you. But that's awesome. I'm definitely glad you brought that up. The main thing that I remember about this, the last 6 episodes that came out in the X-Files, was how they basically had this, I don't know, they made it look like all the stuff, the UFO tech now and all the abductions were military based, but it was from alien tech back in the Roswell days when we were doing all that nuclear testing in New Mexico. And then they've taken that tech for themselves. And then I remember the vaccines that they talk about, injecting people where they can activate that vaccine and cause some type of immune response and basically wipe out the population. You've got the smoking man. Do you guys remember that part?
Oh, yeah.
Sure, sure.
You think there's some truth to that as well?
Oh, I don't know. I think all these TV shows are exciting, but I think there's always just an eyedropper of truth in all of them to get the creative writers writing the show.
Sure.
I mean, when I watched the opening scene, I did not catch the caption at the bottom that said northwestern New Mexico, but I did kind of find it peculiar that the flying saucer they're showing in the opening scene, as large as it is, because it had no fit with Roswell. And the fact that it careened off a mesa is just like the first, chapter of our book.
I think when we were first starting to tell, when you asked us about the story, that I think we missed telling you an initial witness that saw the craft, and it was after the officer Manuel Sandoval followed it to the crash site. Just before it got to the crash site, there was about 5 o'clock in the morning, there was a goat rancher that stepped out of his house and saw it. And I think you relayed that when you did your opening. And he was a Bataan Death March survivor. And last year we were able to go and on their property, and we were the first ones to be able to actually find where the craft hit the bluff. And I can't tell you, after all these years that we've tried to have access and tried to find it and try to get to it, to be able to find it was just incredible. And clearly, when you look at it, it's not something that happened in nature. It is like a metallic scrape, and it's on volcanic rock. So, but to see that then in the X-Files, you're asking questions about some of the storylines with the X-Files. We are fans. We enjoy it. It's very, very exciting. But after 30 years of work, our heart and soul is the Aztec incident and documenting this very important part of history. And so it's tempting sometimes to get kind of off track, but then we have to pull ourselves back on. If that's what we're fully meant to do, then that's what we're trying to do. So it's not that we're not interested in those things, but we just can't put a whole lot of energy into it.
Oh, I certainly appreciate that. I mean, do what you feel is most important, and you guys are just bringing so much good information out there. I certainly applaud you for that, and I know our listeners will as well. I'd also like to recommend for our audience, check out the Aztec Incident.com. You can actually get that book direct there, and if you want a signed copy, so that's awesome. And I'm looking at the picture right now of what you were just referencing here, and you can see that, what you're talking about, so that's fascinating. And I'm going to have to, once again, watch that X-Files, those 6-part series, because you're bringing up some really good points, and I think that people as well should maybe rewatch that series because they can pick up on some of this stuff. But can you walk us through some more of the, I guess you could say, testimonies of others that maybe people would like to hear about before they have a chance to pick up a copy of this book?
Well, yeah, go ahead, Frank.
I was just going to say, why don't we look at the preacher? That story keeps coming back to me.
That's
The
just what I
preacher-
was thinking too. Yep.
Okay. Do you want to do it, Suzanne?
Go ahead. I enjoy it. That's my favorite story, but go ahead.
Okay.
You go ahead and do it.
Just imagine, this is a Baptist preacher. He's just opened his church in Mancos, Colorado, reopened it. And he drives down this dusty road, and he gets up there, all these people on the mesa, and the military's there. These bodies are lying out in front of the saucer. And the military asked him to say some words over these poor creatures that had expired in coming into the atmosphere. Who knows how they died? He went home that night after being told never to mention this to anyone, and he immediately called his deacon over to his house. And his deacon included the deacon's son, and the son is who talked to Scott Ramsey years later. And the son remembered this preacher telling them what he had seen on the mesa near Aztec. And he said, I remember this all my life because that's the first time I ever saw a grown man cry. It so shook his view of the universe that he had to tell somebody, and it caused him to weep in telling the story to his deacon and the son who was present. Isn't that the way you remember it, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. We went up to, Suzanne and I did a little expedition up to Mancos and visited the church. And he helped actually reopen the church back in '48. But he and his wife elected to live down in Aztec because that kind of put him in the epicenter of his territory or route, I guess I should say, because he was sort of a roaming dignitary with the Baptist Church and was helping with the other churches.
He was a circuit preacher.
Circuit preacher, thank you.
Right.
This time of day, my brain goes dead. But they were living in Aztec at the time, and he was going up toward Durango and then to head west over to Mancos. And when he saw the commotion, but for him to tell Bruce Sayer, a man he trusted a lot, and this is a time when he's trying to reopen the church and establish credibility, and certainly not a time to come up with wild flying saucer stories. And we found it very credible, and we found it very interesting. And we went up there and researched to make sure that the Sayers, were members of the church, and that Dr. Brown was in fact the preacher, and just to make sure every part of the story gelled and was factual.
What was interesting was that the minister said that the reason that he wept was it was not that it shook his faith, but that it was just so upsetting to see those small bodies laying there burned and all dead, and to have to say prayers over them. It was just very emotional for him. And I think it probably took him, can you imagine driving down the road and thinking you're on your way, well, I'll just stop, see if I can help out, and then to have this happen in your life. But that story seems to be a theme with so many people that got involved with this, that they were just going about their everyday life and had this incredible experience that just changed their life remarkably. And so many of them were not allowed to share that story. So they walked around carrying it around with them, for many, many years, many of them until they came close to death, when they felt like it was safe enough that they could share it with family members.
Yeah, that's great. And also it's interesting to think about where it came from and why they were here. I'm also trying to think, did they say exactly how many people were actually on the ground that were dead? And
16.
16. Okay, that's right. So, geez. And they were all about the same size and looked young, the same type of clothes and everything too?
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that they did make a notation of, that they all had the same jumpsuit on, but none of them had any type of symbols or insignias or anything that would maybe
tell you a rank or something.
Yeah, give you a rank or anything like that. They seem to be, lateral situations or positions.
Now, were you ever able to find out any insider information on where they came from, though?
No,
I don't think there's any way of figuring that out, and I that would all be speculation. And I think, as Suzanne has pointed out, we are dedicated to, we have four corners of a document, so to speak. We want to show that this really happened. And this still hasn't entered mass consciousness in our culture, the fact that this did happen, that there was a craft from somewhere else, and it did land, and it's not from Earth. And once that is established, the door is open.
Think the government will openly admit it ever on some of the mainstream media outlets?
Don't put any money on it.
Yeah, well said.
No, don't be spending your hard-earned money on the Disclosure Project.
I think this is their version of disclosure, allowing folks like yourselves to do the research and release it independently.
Well, but, thank you for that, but we still don't have, as a friend of mine says, you still don't have the lug nuts from the damn thing.
Right, yeah.
The government allows just enough documents to create more speculation.
So
well
you guys
put.
haven't ever talked to anybody or seen any physical evidence, like you said? Because you did say it was one giant mold, so I guess it'd be kind of tough to shave off a piece of that.
Yeah, and the craft came down intact. It didn't come down like what was described at Roswell, that it impacted the ground. I mean, this impacted the top of a mesa, but none of the people we ever interviewed, and none of the people that were interviewed for, like Richard Ogden's book, nobody ever says that this thing was damaged.
No, but Scully refers to the fact that how disappointed the scientists were that the short time that it took for them to get there, that I don't know if it was military or witnesses or who, but had already taken chunks from the inside.
Well, that wasn't at the crash site. That was years later.
That's right. I'm sorry.
That's
yeah,
true.
But still, to Suzanne's point, over the years as they were trying to figure it out, the scientists told Frank Scully that unfortunately the military breeds souvenir hunters as much as they do rank.
So there were things that they could have worked on, the scientists, that were already gone, which I'm sure was disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Just imagine what they're doing with this tech now, with a fully functional craft like that, to be able to just reverse engineer it, have all the money, resources, brilliant minds putting it together in another aspect. I mean, that's just incredible to think about the
I
possibilities.
think to me something that's really interesting too is some of the scientists that worked on the craft in time developed the company Texas Instruments. I think that's a pretty interesting fact.
Oh, wow. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Go ahead, Scott.
Well, a certain percentage of the scientists that we identified that worked on certain projects during World War II that were confirmed that they matched the claims by the scientists in Scully's first book. They went on to very successful careers. They took a company that they formed called GSI, and by the time that the late 60s, early 70s rolled around, they took that company public from a private ownership and changed the name to Texas Instruments. So all the wonderful technology that you saw back in the 70s, like the new calculators that we used in high school that really blew our minds, you kind of have to sit back and say, so was there any connection to the technology that these guys at Texas Instruments came up with? Is there any relation to that with the flying disc? Of course, it would be pure speculation, but you have to ask yourself that question.
Right.
Oh, sure. I mean, a lot of the technology that we have now, there's a good possibility. Do you remember the Phoenix lights back in '97?
Oh, yeah. I just
Sure.
left Phoenix the day before.
Oh, really? Man, bummer.
That's
I bet
the
you wish
story
you
of my
stayed
life.
just one extra day.
Yeah, a day late and $1 short. That's the story of my life.
And I was there the day after, by the way.
Oh my God!
Are you kidding me? Were you really?
Yes,
Oh, my goodness.
at a
My-
conference.
One of my best friends was a commercial pilot on approach into Phoenix and heard all the chatter on the radio from all the other pilots talking about being vectored around because of this huge object. But unfortunately, he was many miles to the east and wasn't able to see it. So you got three of us that were all a day late and $1 short.
No
We're a
synchronicity
day
there
early.
whatsoever.
No,
Mhm.
Well, that's because you guys are putting all this energy into the Aztec incident, so it's just giving you more of an opportunity to do that stuff. I'm telling you, where you've been, the things that you've done, the people you've talked to, the documents that you have access to and that you've compiled in this book is truly an encyclopedia of knowledge in about 320 pages. So I just recommend everybody that has any interest in the disclosure of extraterrestrials or space brothers, and not just the possibilities of them being shapeshifters that like to eat humans for appetizers, I think that this is really cool. And I appreciate you guys coming out on the show. Is there anything else that you could share with us before we end up closing out this evening?
Well, I want to make an offer that Suzanne and Frank and I like to make to your listening audience. The first person that goes on and buys a book off the website, www.theaztecincident.com, under comments, if they enter the word Rex Bear, they will purchase a book that will be signed by Suzanne and I, and we will give them free, as a bonus, a 1-hour documentary on the Aztec incident. It's called Aztec 1948. It's a $20 value. We'll throw it in free to your first caller. Or not first caller, but first person that goes on and buys a book.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I like that. That's great. That'll give people an opportunity to read something fantastic, get the extra bonus, and then just an autographed copy from you guys. I think that's just stellar. So now the website too has just got some really cool info. I see you've got the pictures down there on the sites as well, the reviews from, obviously one of the pioneers in disclosure, Stanton Friedman, Timothy Good, Peter Davenport. So this is great. Really appreciate you guys coming on. And if you put anything else together or have anything new in the future, would love to have the opportunity to speak with you again.
If I could mention, please look us up on Facebook. We oftentimes have pictures of the crash site. We have new information if we're going to be giving a talk. But it we can give you can look at pictures and things that give you a better feel for the entire area.
Well, thanks you guys. This has been great. I hope that you get on the top of the charts at Amazon. And
thanks,
I
Rick.
hope to see you again.
Absolutely. Folks, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. You'll have access to all the latest podcasts, first and free. Also, if you haven't already, make sure to check out our brand new website, leakproject.com, where you'll have access to a plethora of intel. You've got topics on all sorts of things here, guys, and we just update this every single day. And be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Good night.